Arthur Costello sat in his usual booth. The corner booth. From here, he could see the entire restaurant. The door, the kitchen, the bar. Every entrance, every exit. It was a habit born from a lifetime of watching his own back. Trattoria Milano was his. Not on paper, of course. The deed was in the name of a nervous man named Sal, whose grandfather had opened the place with bread, sauce, and a dream. But everyone knew. The red sauce in the kitchen might belong to Sal, but the red ink in the city's ledgers belonged to Arthur. He was a man carved from old stone and older rules. His hair was silver, his suit was charcoal grey, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a storm. People didn't look into them for long. Tonight was quiet. The low hum of conversation, the clinking of forks on ceramic, the soft Italian music that was always playing. Frank, his lieutenant, sat opposite him. Frank was a block of a man, loyal as a shadow and just as silent. They weren't eating. They were waiting. A deal was being concluded. A man in a suit 2 sizes too expensive slid a thick manila envelope across the table. He was sweating, despite the cool air. Arthur didn't look at it. He simply nodded. The man stood, mumbled his thanks, and practically fled the restaurant. Business was done. It was then that the routine was broken. A girl. A waitress. She was new, maybe a few months. Arthur had noticed her before. She was quiet, efficient, and she kept her eyes down. She had a tiredness about her that went deeper than a long shift. It was a weariness of the soul. Her name was Elena. He knew that because Sal made a point of telling him who worked in his places. She approached the table. This was not done. No one approached Arthur's table unless they were summoned. Frank's shoulders tensed. His hand shifted slightly under his jacket, a gesture as natural to him as breathing. The girl, Elena, stopped beside the booth. She held the small black tray with his bill on it. Her knuckles were white. "Mr. Costello," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. Arthur didn't answer. He just watched her. He saw the slight tremor in her hand, the frantic pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. This was not a simple waitress bringing a check. This was a mouse walking into a lion's den, knowing it was a den. She placed the bill on the table. Every night for the past 2 months, she had done the same thing. She would bring the bill for his espresso, and on it, she would have taken her pen and drawn a single, neat line through the words service charge. It was a small act of defiance, or perhaps pride. A refusal to accept a tip she felt she hadn't earned from a man who wasn't a customer so much as a force of nature occupying a space. He always left the money anyway, a crisp $50 bill tucked under his cup. He respected her strange, quiet ritual. Tonight was different. Tonight, the words service charge were not crossed out. They were underlined. Twice. And beside the underlined words, in shaky, desperate script, was a single word. Help. Frank saw it. He started to rise, his face hardening into a mask of dismissal. He would handle this. He would send her away, deal with whatever foolishness this was. A hand rose. Arthur's hand. He didn't look at Frank. He just held his hand up, palm flat, a simple, absolute command to stop. Frank froze, then slowly settled back into his seat. Arthur picked up the bill. He looked at the underlined words. He looked at the plea written beside them. Then, he raised his eyes and looked at the girl. Really looked at her. He saw past the cheap uniform and the tired expression. He saw a terror so profound it was almost silent. It was the terror of an animal caught in a trap, one that had chewed its own leg off and still could not get free. The quiet hum of the restaurant faded away. There was only the booth, the girl, and the single word on a slip of paper. A contract had been offered. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next is a testament to the fact that sometimes, the only person who can help you is the last person you should ever ask. The story of this bill, this girl, and this man is not about money or power. It is about a debt that could never be repaid. If you want to see how a simple plea can change the course of a man's life, like this video and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this one. We love knowing where our stories are reaching, so drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. The world is a big place, but a good story makes it feel a little smaller. Now, let's get back to it. Arthur Costello's world operated on a very strict set of principles. They were not good principles. They were not legal principles. But they were his, and in his world, they were law. He had built an empire on these rules, a kingdom of shadows and whispers where his word was the only currency that mattered. One of his rules was to never get involved in the small, messy lives of civilians. Their problems were not his problems. He was a shark, and sharks did not concern themselves with the minnows that swam around them. It was cleaner that way. Simpler. Business was business, and emotion was a liability he had cut from his personal ledger long ago. But he had other rules, too. Older rules. Rules that were buried deeper in the bedrock of the man he was before he became Arthur Costello. Rule number 1, you do not touch children. Ever. You do not harm them, you do not threaten them, you do not even use them as leverage. They were off limits. They were sacrosanct. To break this rule was to invite a kind of wrath that had no end. He remembered his own childhood. The cold floor of a tenement apartment. The smell of cabbage and despair. He remembered his mother, a woman who seemed to be held together by sheer will and threadbare seams. He remembered her hands, chapped and red from hot water and harsh soap, working day and night for pennies to put food on their table. He remembered the fear in her eyes when the rent was due, a fear she tried so hard to hide from her son. That same fear was now staring back at him from the face of this waitress. He looked down at the bill again. Help, such a small word to carry so much weight. He gestured to the seat beside Frank. Sit. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air like a razor. Elena flinched, her eyes darting around the restaurant. People were starting to notice. Sal was hovering near the kitchen door, wringing his hands. Sit down, child, Arthur said again, his tone softer this time, but no less firm. She slid into the booth, perching on the very edge of the leather seat as if ready to bolt at any moment. She kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, twisting a cheap napkin into a shredded mess. Talk to me, Arthur commanded quietly. Start from the beginning. And don't leave anything out. Her story came out in a torrent of hushed, panicked words. It was a story as old as the city itself. A story of bad luck, desperation, and the predators who feed on it. Her son, Leo. He was 7. He had a hole in his heart, a congenital defect the doctors had been monitoring. It had suddenly become worse. He needed surgery. An expensive surgery that her insurance, a flimsy plan from the restaurant, refused to cover in full. She was thousands of dollars short. She had no family to turn to. No one. So she went to a man. A man someone had told her about, someone who could help when the bank said no. His name was Rico Velez. Arthur's expression did not change, but a cold stillness settled over him. He knew the name. Velez was a bottom feeder. A lone shark who operated on the fringes, preying on the weak and the desperate. He was not part of Arthur's organization. He was an independent, a jackal snapping at the heels of the lions. Arthur had allowed him to operate because his business was small, and it kept the truly desperate from getting into even worse trouble. Or so he had thought. Elena had borrowed the money. $5,000. The interest rate was criminal, but she had been blinded by the need to save her son. She had been making the payments, barely. She worked double shifts, ate stale bread for dinner, sold every piece of jewelry she owned. But she was falling behind. The interest kept compounding, the debt growing like a cancer. He came to my apartment last night, she whispered, her voice cracking. He said the payments weren't enough. He wanted more. Arthur remained silent, letting her speak. He knew what was coming. He said I could work off the debt. In other ways she couldn't meet his eyes. The shame and fear rolled off her in waves. I told him no. I begged him for more time. She took a shaky breath. That's when he saw a picture of Leo on the mantelpiece. He picked it up. Her voice dropped so low it was barely audible. He said he was a cute kid. He said it would be a shame if something happened to him. If his mother couldn't protect him. There it was. The line. Rico Velez had crossed the line. Arthur felt a familiar coldness spread through his chest. It was an old feeling, a sleeping beast that had just been prodded awake. He looked at Elena, at the raw terror in her eyes. It was his mother's terror. It was the terror of every good person backed into a corner by a world that did not care. He's coming for me tonight, she said, the words tumbling out. After my shift. He said he's done waiting. He'll be waiting for me in the alley. For months, she had crossed out the service charge on his bill. It was her small way of holding on to her pride. She was a mother fighting for her son, she was not an object of pity. She would not take charity. But tonight, that pride had been burned away by sheer, animal terror. Underlining the words was not a request for a tip. It was a surrender. A last, desperate prayer sent to the only power she knew of that might be able to answer. Arthur's mind was a whirlwind of cold, hard calculation. His rules were clear. Do not get involved. This was a street-level problem. A messy, emotional entanglement with no profit in it. Getting involved would be a breach of his own protocol. It would set a precedent. Soon, everyone with a sob story would be coming to his table. And yet, he saw his mother's face, exhausted and pale in the dim light of their tiny apartment. He remembered the feeling of helplessness, of being a small boy unable to protect the person he loved most in the world. He had sworn to himself then, a silent, childish vow, that when he grew up, he would never be powerless again. He would become so powerful that no one could ever threaten the people he chose to protect. What was the point of all this power, of this empire of fear and respect, if he let a jackal like Rico Velez devour a desperate mother in his own backyard? What were the rules for, if not to protect the very idea of a line that could not be crossed? The conflict raged within him for only a moment. It was a battle between the man he had become and the boy he had once been. The boy won. He reached across the table and slowly, deliberately, took the bill from where it lay. He didn't look at the amount. It was irrelevant. He folded the slip of paper once, then twice, with methodical precision. He tucked it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, placing it over his heart. The gesture was his answer. He was accepting the contract. He looked at Elena. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying mixture of hope and fear. Go back to work, he said, his voice calm and steady. Finish your shift. When it's over, walk out the back door and go straight to your car. Do not stop. Do not look behind you. Do not talk to anyone. Just go home to your son. But he'll be there, she stammered. Rico will be having a conversation, Arthur said, his eyes turning to ice. He and I need to discuss the terms of your account. A flicker of understanding, or perhaps just blind faith, crossed her face. She nodded, a single, jerky movement. She slid out of the booth, mumbled a thank you that was lost in the air, and scurried away, disappearing back into the rhythm of the restaurant. Arthur watched her go. Then he turned his gaze to Frank. The lieutenant had been watching the entire exchange, his face an unreadable mask. He knew his boss. He knew the rules. And he knew he had just witnessed every single one of them being broken. Arthur didn't need to raise his voice. His commands were delivered in the same quiet tone he used for everything. It was the quiet that made them so terrifying. Get the car, he said. Frank nodded. I want to know everything about Rico Velez. Where he lives, who his friends are, who he owes money to, who owes him. I want to know what he ate for breakfast this morning. I want it all, and I want it 10 minutes ago." Frank's phone was already in his hand, his thumb flying across the screen. "And Frank," Arthur added, his voice dropping even lower. "I want 2 of our best men outside. One watching the front, one watching the back. That girl walks to her car, and nothing and no one gets within 50 feet of her. Is that clear?" "Crystal, Art," Frank said, not looking up from his phone. The machine was in motion. The vast, unseen network of power and influence that Arthur Costello commanded was now focused, with all its terrible weight, on one small-time loan shark named Rico Velez. Rico had made a business out of other people's misery. Tonight, his business was being permanently dissolved. The plan was brutally simple. There would be no negotiation. No warning. This was not a business dispute, it was an extermination. Rico Velez was a disease, and Arthur was the cure. They waited. Arthur sat in the back of his black sedan, parked in the shadows of a street opposite the alleyway behind Trattoria Milano. The car was silent, the engine off. It was just another parked car on a dark city street. Invisible. Frank was in the driver's seat, monitoring reports coming in on his phone. He had been feeding Arthur information for the last hour. Rico Velez. Age 34. A two-bit thug with delusions of grandeur. He had a small crew, 2 other bottom feeders just like him. They operated out of a grimy office above a pawn shop. They had a list of debtors, mostly single mothers, recent immigrants, people with nowhere else to turn. People who were invisible to the rest of the world. Until tonight. "He's got 2 with him," Frank murmured, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the alley. "Manny and Jax. Both have priors. Assault, petty theft. Nothing serious." "They are all serious tonight," Arthur replied, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking at the alley. He was looking inward, at the cold, hard place where decisions like this were made. He felt no anger. No rage. Just a profound, chilling sense of purpose. He was a surgeon, and this was the removal of a tumor. The back door of the restaurant opened. A sliver of yellow light cut through the darkness. It was Elena. She hesitated for a moment, a small, frightened figure silhouetted against the light. She clutched her purse to her chest like a shield. Then, as if remembering his instructions, she took a deep breath and began to walk towards the small parking lot at the end of the alley. She did not look back. As soon as she was clear of the doorway, 3 figures detached themselves from the deeper shadows near a dumpster. Rico Velez. He was shorter than Arthur expected, with a swagger that was meant to project confidence but only broadcast insecurity. His 2 goons fanned out on either side of him. They started to follow her. "Now," Arthur said. 2 other cars, which had been parked further down the street, silently flickered their lights off and began to roll forward, sealing both ends of the alley. It was done without a sound. Frank got out of the car. Arthur followed. From the opposite end of the alley, 2 more of Arthur's men emerged from the darkness. They were large men, dressed in dark work coats, their faces grim. They moved with the quiet efficiency of professionals. Rico and his crew were halfway down the alley when they realized something was wrong. They stopped, sensing the trap closing around them. Rico turned, a sneer on his face, ready to intimidate whoever was there. The sneer died on his lips when he saw who was walking toward him. He recognized Arthur Costello. Everyone in their world knew who Arthur Costello was. He was a myth. A ghost story told to frighten younger, more ambitious men. And the ghost was walking right at him. Panic flashed in Rico's eyes. Manny and Jax were not as smart. They just saw 2 men blocking their path. Jax reached inside his jacket. It was a fatal mistake. Frank moved with a speed that was shocking for a man his size. He closed the distance in 3 long strides. There was a sickening crunch of bone as Frank's fist connected with Jax's jaw. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even hit the pavement. Manny stared in shock for a half second. that was all the time Arthur's other man needed. A swift, brutal takedown left Manny gasping on the grimy asphalt, his arm bent at an angle it was never meant to be. The entire confrontation had taken less than 5 seconds. It was silent, efficient, and utterly final. Now, it was just Rico. And Arthur. Rico was frozen, his mouth hanging open. He looked from his fallen men to the calm, approaching figure of Arthur Costello. The predator had become the prey. Arthur stopped a few feet in front of him. He didn't seem angry. He seemed disappointed. As if a trusted employee had made a clerical error. Rico Velez, Arthur said, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow alley. We have a problem with an account. Rico found his voice. Mr. Costello. I didn't know she was with you. I swear. If I'd known, I would never. She is not with me, Arthur interrupted, his voice cutting like glass. She is a working woman. A mother. And she lives in my city. That is all I needed to know. It is all you needed to know. Arthur reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded restaurant bill. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger. Do you know what this is? He asked. Rico stared at it, confused. It's a receipt. This is a contract, Arthur corrected him. This is a marker. A plea for help from a decent person who you decided to terrorize. You see, Rico, we have rules in our business. We do not operate in the daylight world. We do not bring our filth into the lives of civilians. And we do not, ever, threaten children. Arthur took a step closer. The air grew thick with menace. You picked up a picture of her son, Arthur stated. It wasn't a question. You told her it would be a shame if something happened to him. Rico started to tremble. It was just talk, Mr. Costello. Just business. I was just trying to scare her. You succeeded, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You scared her. And she, in turn, came to me. You brought this problem to my table. And I am a man who solves problems. Permanently. He gestured to Frank, who stepped forward and frisked a terrified Rico, pulling a thick wad of cash from his pocket and a small, cheap pistol from his waistband. Frank handed both to Arthur. Arthur thumbed through the cash. It was a few $1,000s. This will be the first payment for the boy's surgery, he said, handing the money to Frank. The rest will be taken from your assets, which, as of this moment, belong to me. He then looked at the pistol in his other hand, holding it with distaste as if it were a dead rat. And this? This is for cowards who threaten women in dark alleys. With a sudden, violent motion, he smashed the gun against the brick wall. Metal and plastic shattered, the pieces scattering across the ground. Rico flinched, letting out a small cry. Your business is concluded, Arthur said, his voice flat and final. You and your associates will no longer be operating. Not here. Not anywhere. He turned his back on Rico, a sign of ultimate dismissal. Frank, he said, walking away. Clean this up. I don't want to see or hear from these three ever again. Close their accounts. Consider them closed, Frank said. The implication was clear and absolute. Rico Velez, Manny, and Jax had just vanished from the world. They would become another one of the city's ghost stories. A cautionary tale whispered among lowlifes about the price of breaking the old rules. Arthur walked out of the alley and got back into his car without a second glance. The problem had been solved. The account was settled. The next morning, Elena was getting her son, Leo, ready for school when there was a knock on her apartment door. Her heart leaped into her throat. She peered through the peephole and saw a large man in a dark suit. It was the man who had been sitting with Mr. Costello. Her hand trembled as she opened the door a crack. Frank didn't try to enter. He simply held out a thick, plain white envelope. From Mr. Costello, he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. He said this should cover it. She hesitantly took the envelope. It was heavy. She opened it and gasped. It was filled with cash. Stacks of $100 bills. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was more than enough for Leo's surgery. It was enough to give them a new start. Tucked inside was a small, typed note. It read, "For Leo. The debt is paid." I can't accept this," she stammered, trying to hand it back. "I have to pay him back. I can work, I can." Frank gently pushed her hand away. "He considers the matter closed," he said. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway, clutching a miracle. A week passed. The fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a bewildering sense of relief. Leo had his appointment scheduled with the best surgeon in the city. For the first time in years, Elena felt like she could breathe. That night, Arthur Costello returned to the Trattoria Milano. He sat in his usual booth, ordered his usual espresso. Elena knew this was her moment. With her heart pounding, she approached his table. She had rehearsed what she would say 100 times. "Mr. Costello," she began, her voice shaking. "Thank you. I don't have the words. But I will pay you back. Every single cent. I'll work for the rest of my life if I have to." Arthur took a slow sip of his espresso. He didn't look at her. He seemed to be studying the patterns on the tablecloth. "There is no debt," he said quietly. "But I have to," she insisted. "I can't just take it. It isn't right." He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. There was no menace in them now. Just a deep, profound weariness. He tapped his chest, over the pocket where he had placed her bill. "You already paid me," he told her. "You gave me something far more valuable than money." She looked at him, confused. "What? What did I give you?" "A reminder," he said simply. "You reminded me what all this is for. Sometimes, even men like me forget." They sat in silence for a long moment. The gap between their two worlds seemed to shrink, just for an instant. She saw not a gangster, not a feared crime boss, but just a man. An old, tired man carrying the weight of 1,000 violent choices. She had to ask. The question had been burning in her mind all week. "Are you a good man, Mr. Costello?" she asked, the words barely a whisper. He considered the question for a long time. A faint, sad smile touched the corner of his lips. It was a fleeting expression, gone as quickly as it appeared. "No, child," he said softly. "I am not a good man." He paused, his gaze distant. "But tonight, for your son, I was allowed to be the right one." He placed a crisp $50 bill on the table and stood up to leave. As he walked past her, he paused and placed a small, stiff card on her empty service tray. It was stark white, with nothing on it but a single phone number, embossed in black ink. No name, no address. "If anyone ever troubles you or your son again," he said, his voice low and firm, "you call that number. They will not trouble you a second time." It was not a suggestion. It was a vow. A shield of protection extended over her and her son for the rest of their lives. And then he was gone, disappearing into the city night, leaving Elena standing by the table, holding the promise of a future she never thought she would have. 10 years passed. The auditorium was packed. The air buzzed with the excited chatter of parents and the rustle of graduation gowns. On the stage, a handsome, confident young man stood at the podium. He adjusted the microphone, a bright, easy smile on his face. "My name is Leo," he began, and the crowd fell silent. In the third row, Elena watched her son, tears streaming freely down her face. They were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming joy and gratitude. Leo was healthy. He was strong. He was the valedictorian of his graduating class and had a full scholarship to study medicine at a prestigious university. He wanted to be a heart surgeon. Her life, once a daily struggle for survival, was now one of peace. After the surgery, she had used the remaining money to go to nursing school. She was now a respected pediatric nurse at the very hospital that had saved her son's life. She had bought a small house in a quiet suburb. A house with a yard where Leo had learned to throw a baseball. A safe house. She owed it all to a single night, a desperate plea, and a dangerous man's forgotten principles. Unseen, unnoticed, a figure stood in the shadows at the very back of the auditorium. Arthur Costello was an old man now. He moved slower, the weight of his years and his life heavy on his shoulders. He no longer ran the city's shadows, Frank handled the day-to-day business. Arthur was a ghost, a legend. But he still kept his promises. He watched the young man on the stage speak about hope, about second chances, about the kindness of strangers. A rare, almost imperceptible smile touched Arthur's lips. He didn't stay for the whole speech. He just needed to see it. To see the result of his investment. He turned and slipped out the back door as quietly as he had arrived. Later that day, he sat alone in his vast, silent office. It was a room of dark wood, rich leather, and unspoken secrets. Behind his large desk, on a wall filled with shelves of old books, there was a single, ornate frame. It did not hold a fancy painting or an award. It held a faded, 10-year-old restaurant bill. Behind the glass, the paper was yellowed with age. But the words were still clear. The words service charge, underlined twice in a shaky hand. And beside them, the single word that had changed everything. Help. It was his most prized possession. A reminder that his empire was built not just on fear but on a single, unbreakable rule born from the memory of a poor boy who couldn't protect his mother. True strength is not measured by the power you wield over others, but by the protection you offer to the vulnerable. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. And redemption can be found in the most unexpected places, in a quiet restaurant, on a slip of paper, in the desperate eyes of a stranger. For in a world full of monsters, sometimes it takes one to keep the others at bay. And sometimes, even a monster can be an angel in disguise, answering a prayer that was never even spoken aloud.